Matthew chapter 7. Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount. In John chapter 8, I want to read this for you. Jesus went up into the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and he taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees, those guys just keep showing up, don't they? And the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And what's amazing is what they say. Taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. It's a little reminiscent of John chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, isn't it? Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but that through him the world might be saved. And the reason is, how many times does it take for God to say something for it to be true? Once. She's already condemned. The only one that could have cast a stone didn't. Think about that. Now, there's been much thought, and this is for another time, but there's been much thought as to what he wrote on the ground. Jokes have been made, snide remarks, but the fact of the matter is it wasn't funny to that woman. And apparently it wasn't funny to Jesus. And so we live in a world where there are these parameters. In Matthew chapter 7, that's what Jesus has done. He's taken two parameters and he set them with regard to human relationships. The first parameter is do not judge at the very beginning. And the second parameter is start loving. And everything in between is the how and why. So there you have it. Don't judge. Don't be of a condemning spirit. And then on the reverse side of that is start loving. Perfect love casts out all fear. What Jesus was sharing with that group on the hillside is monument to the task. And here's the task. Some people are easier to love than others. Amen? But we are still to love. Now, truthfully, I got to make this known. That's not to say that there aren't some people in the world that are selfless. They are humanitarian in their effort. But no attempt to reach God by good works is going to suffice. But that's not to say that there aren't some people that, for unselfish reasons, do. Now, we have a tendency to look at those people, don't we? Over the rim of our glasses. And in the back of our minds, we're asking a question. What do they want? What are they after? Now, Chuck Norris is kind of a hero of mine, and for other reasons that I won't say, but he's a martial artist, that kind of thing. Well, Chuck's 81 years old. And if anybody can advise me on life, I figured it might as well be Chuck Norris. So his wife asked me to watch the video, and so I did. And I find out that there are three enemies to every man's health and woman's health. And I'm thinking, okay, Chuck, this is great. You're telling me what those enemies are. You're giving me the solution to a problem. You're not trying to sell anything. And then at the end of the video, what do you think it was about? Selling me a supplement. And I'm like, Chuck, you're killing me here. Yeah. In the days of Daniel, in the days of Esther, there were kings, and those kings had such power. When the king said something, it was law. Most referred to it as the law of the Medes and the Persians. That's why when Nebuchadnezzar pronounced a sentence on Daniel, he couldn't take it back. That's how much they believed in the king's oath. When Esther was before the king swore certain things that he couldn't take back. There was a particular king. Now, I'm going to butcher his name, but here we go. Cambyses II of Persia. He was a king that swore by his own judgment. There was a judge by the name of Samsonus. And here's the deal, not Samson, but Samsones. In his kingdom, the law was held in such high esteem that the judges feared and trembled. This judge took a bribe. He took a bribe. And when the king found out about this bribe, he had him brought before him, and they skinned him alive. True story. They made leather strips out of this judge's skin, and they upholstered a chair. They used that judge's skin to upholster a chair. And then he had that judge's son sit in that chair as a judge. And every judge thereafter. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's probably given the idea that when you judge, you better judge correctly. Jesus is saying, judge ye not. Do not pass sentence. Don't become the judge, jury, and the executioner of anyone. Now, I used to think about it like this. You know, the people that probably need to hear it weren't there. But that's just not true. This is applicable to everybody that was there. But can you imagine if you were sitting there and you were thinking to yourself, yeah, it's about time. Cha-ching. Pay no attention to that. It's about time. We're not on video today, so I can do just about anything. Pay no attention to the man behind the pulpit. Here's the thing. You can think about it all you want to, but the reality of it is this. When you and I pass sentence, when you and I try to usurp authority by knowing what really no one can know but God, we're trying to take the place of God. And so we found out, first of all, don't judge. Don't pass a sentence. And last week we preached about those things, and then this week I'm just kind of, driving home the point, okay? How many of you know what this is? It's a boomerang. Now, I practiced with this thing, and the idea was I was going to throw this thing out, and it was going to come back to me, and I was going to catch it. But I don't have enough room. And I don't want to kill somebody. For just the lack of courage, I'm going to just leave it right up here. I'm going to give it to that young lady right there in the back when I'm done. And then she can go home and kill somebody. I'm just kidding. You're not supposed to throw this at animals or people, okay? The boomerang originated in Australia. The Aborigines, they use this. Now, there are two types. One is the non-returning type. It's flat. It was meant to kill prey. They used it to hunt, and they used it in war. And so when it struck, they would trim the edges and they would sharpen the edges. There was a little hook on the end of it, so that whatever they hit, they pretty well put down. When Jesus in Matthew chapter 1 says, judge ye not, so that you will be not judged, it's the idea of the things that come out of your mouth and the judgment that you send forth will come back at you like a boomerang. Now, I don't know a lot about physics, but I do know this. They tell me that when you strike an object, that the force, the inertia that takes to strike that object, that what comes back at you is that force plus something. Now, I've seen this happen on the golf course, and most of us have, but I haven't seen it actually played out completely like my brother did. One of his buddies was getting married. So for their bachelor party, they went to play golf. And now he's getting married that evening. So they're playing golf, and his buddy got mad. If you've ever played golf, you can sympathize a little bit. But he got so mad that he took his club and he hit a tree and broke his club off. But what happened is the party broke off, turned around that tree and came back at him and impaled him. Yeah. Well, my brother, he's looking, he called him by name and he said, what have you done? And he goes, well, it looks pretty bad, don't it? They took this guy to the hospital. Fortunately, this doctor had seen this before. I guess he must have had a practice close to the golf club, okay? So he'd seen this before, and he explained this to my brother, that when he struck that tree and broke that iron off, the force that came back at him was greater than the force in which he hit the tree. So he pulled out the piece of metal, stitched him up because it did not strike any internal organ, and they went back and finished the golf game. When we judge, what we've done is we've sent out something that comes back at us. And so Jesus was warning against judging. Now, here's the thing. If I were those people on that hillside in real time, I have to believe that most of them were thinking about the Pharisees and the scribes and not themselves. But this is true of all of us. So it's applicable to everyone. Don't judge, because when you judge, the same measure in which you judge is going to come back at you. Now, some call that karma. I don't believe in karma. There's a country song that says, what goes around comes around. Now, that's a popular belief. I don't believe in that. What I do believe in is what Jesus said. And I believe in the universal law of sowing and reaping. If you want to sow to something, you're going to reap something. Sometimes that you reap a consequence. When you sow bountifully to the Lord, and it's speaking most importantly to Christians about finances, but it's not limited to that. If you sow in the Spirit, guess what? You also reap of the Spirit. But when you sow in the flesh, you also reap of the flesh. And there's not a whole lot of good in our flesh. That doesn't mean that we're incapable of doing a good deed. That'd be kind of foolish for me to say. But he goes on and he says, we know that he was not saying, do not ever discern anything. He wasn't saying you don't need a court of law. He was simply saying, don't find yourself as being that judge and jury and executioner. Why? Because the same measure in which you judge is going to come back at you. Men will do that. Now, there's another principle here. It's the principle of giving. When we give, and we give as unto the Lord, or we give as unto people, that God gives us back. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and men give back to us. Now, those are two principles that we ought to write down and not ever forget. And then he goes on in verse 5, and we recognize that there is the need to confess. There's the need to confess when we've been guilty of judging. And we have to cast out, if you will, this beam that's in our eye so that we might remove that which is in our brother's eye. Now, this is primarily for people that know the Lord. But that's not to say everybody on that hillside did. Any more than it's to say that all of us that come and hear me are necessarily saved. But the principle still applies. And then in verse 6, it's a pivotal verse. I'll tell you why. He says, don't offer up holy things to dogs. And I gave you that last week. You understand what that means. You wouldn't take a sacrifice that was offered unto God and give it to a dog. And then he goes on and says this, don't cast pearls before swine, hogs. So my question, as I'm sure your question is, okay, I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to pass a sentence. But yet you tell me that I'm to have a discernment and I'm to know which is the dog and which is the hog. How do I do that? I'm getting ready to show you. Here's the two parameters. And by the way, people read the Bible and they think, well, you know, the Bible's really complicated. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible. I give you that. But the fact of the matter is what Jesus said on more than one occasion, that the whole law, the law of God and of the prophets can be summed up in two things. What were they? It's Matthew, what is it? I wrote it down. Matthew 18. What is that? That's still not right. Matthew 22. He said this, he said, you're to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy mind, thy soul, and thy strength. And you're to love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law is wrapped up in those two things. So here's what's going on. He's giving them this judge not. And then in verse 12, he's saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We call that the golden rule. And everything in between is telling us how and why to do both. I am to be able to discern between the dogs and the hogs. How do I do that? Well, look at verse 7. A lot of people will take verse 7 kind of out of context. Now, when I say that, I mean this. They'll take it and they'll say, see there, anything I ask for, I get. I just need to ask God, and I get it. I need to seek, and I'll find it. I need to knock, and it'll be opened unto me. You know, there's a primary law of interpretation that says I'm not going to pull something out of context and make it say whatever I want it to say. James, our brother, said this, you have not because you ask not. You ask, but when you ask amiss because you ask to consume it selfishly upon your own lust. There are parameters as to when we pray. We need to be in a submissive spirit. We need to be obedient to God. Once again, if we're not obedient unto God, our prayers are not as effective. So there's some conditions when we ask God for things, right? Well, let's just keep it right where it is. How am I going to discern between the dogs and the hogs? Well, look at verse 7. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. And then he gives the explanation. And the explanation is, for everyone that asketh receiveth. He that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. In the context of what? Discerning between the dogs and the hogs. If I really want to be careful, if I really want to be able to discern righteously, then all I need to do is to ask in sincerity. All I need to do is to seek honestly. And the idea of knocking on a door carries with it a little bit of desperation. I'm not going to leave off until I get an answer. And that's in the context of verses 1 through 6. That's how you discern between the dogs and the hogs. I got to tell you, there's some times when, and I'll tell you just very briefly, there was a young man, a grandmother came to me years ago when I was a youth director over in Dallas. Had a big youth department. And she came, sought me out and said, my grandson, he's running with the wrong crowd. And he's kind of, I don't know why I'm hesitating to say that. He's kind of getting hooked up with the wrong religious people. Will you talk to him? I said, sure. Having dealt with teenagers before, I kind of figured there was more to it than what meets the eye. Well, he wants to meet you at, it was a restaurant like Denny's, okay? So when I walked in, there he was, and two other guys were sitting with him. And I'm like, I've been down this road before. This isn't my first rodeo. You guys are loaded for bear. I know what's getting ready to happen. So I sat down on the other side of the table, and I said, what's up? And the next thing you know, I'm getting bombarded with all of these things about, they were Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way. And so they're attacking, and I'm listening. And I said, I'll tell you what, I had to make a decision at that moment. I want to talk to that kid, but I don't really care to talk to you two. And I didn't say that. Here's what I did. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll talk to you about anything you want to, but we're going to talk about Jesus first. Well, guess what? They separated themselves from me. You see, the discernment naturally just doesn't come to me. You know, I mean, we all guess wrong. We think we've got it figured when we don't. But I knew this. I'm not going to cast pearls before swine, and I'm not going to offer something that's holy unto a dog. Now, can those folks be saved? Yes. But my concern was that young man first. Will I ever talk or witness to a Jehovah's Witness? Of course. Mormon? Sure. But the fact of the matter is, there are going to be times when you're going to be required to discern. I don't think that there's anybody that really and truly, deep down in their heart and soul, doesn't believe in God. But the devil believes in God and trembles. That doesn't make one a Christian. So what Jesus is saying is, he's saying, here are these two parameters. Don't judge and do love. And the way that you discern between the dogs and the hogs is you ask, you seek, and you knock. And when you do that, you will find, you will seek, and you'll have that question answered. And nobody wants to go out and blatantly call anybody a dog or a hog. Let's just be real. But the fact is, there are some things that just aren't meant for those that have no affinity with things that are spiritual. Now, here's the thing. When I read the rest of this, I think you'll recognize it as we read it. You know, not everything in the world is bad. It's not. I mean, there are things in this world that I believe God uses to build character in us. You know, I didn't get saved till I was 18 years of age. And I just got a text from my buddy up in Indiana, my best friend since second grade. He's doing the funeral of a young girl that we used to work with. Now, you have to understand, this is in the 70s. And we worked in kind of like a Happy Days diner, and she passed away, and so forth and so on. And so I was able to have a little flashback. By the way, if you want to see me after church, I'll show you what I looked like when I was 16. My wife goes, please don't do that. Yeah, please don't do that. What am I saying? I'm saying that for 4 years I worked at a Charlie's Drive-In. I didn't go to many football games. I played Little League Baseball, but after that, I pretty much worked. My dad told me, he said, you know, once you start working, you never stop. And so I started working. But there was something that I was involved in. And it's called the International Order of Demolay. And you probably have never heard of it. But it's like young Masons, okay? Shriners, that kind of thing. And I was involved in it. And there's a certain camaraderie there, and there's certain things that I learned and certain things that were taught to me. When I was saved at 18, some of that stuff I had to leave off because I knew it wasn't right. But there's one thing, of all the things that I learned, I went on to be a master counselor. I went on to get the RD award, which is the highest award you can receive in the Order of Demolay. And then there's one other award, and it's called a Chevalier Award, and I received that. I went as far as you could go in the international. Right now, I could go into any international chapter in the Order of Demolay, and they would accept me. You want to know what I learned? And I don't think it's one of those secret things, okay? I learned that I am never to judge a person by what he has done. Because given the same set of circumstances, I might have acted even more unwisely than I have judged him to have acted. That is word for word out of my manual. And here we are 50 some odd years later, and I remember it like it was yesterday. You go, well, what good is that? You tell me. You tell me. Judge ye not, so that you are not judged. And then he goes on and he says this, and I think this is important for us all to understand. When I was looking at that section on judging not, did you know that the Greeks, many times on a real serious offense, that they would hold court at night in the dark? And the reason is so that they wouldn't see any faces. All they would hear is the facts. and they would base their judgment on the facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Anybody want to tell me who said that? A guy named Friday in Dragnet. Just the facts. Just the facts. And so that's how important it is not to judge. But how important is it to love? Well, let's go on. For everyone that asketh receives, he that seeketh finds. To him that knocks it shall be opened. Or what man is there of you whom his son asks bread, and you give him a stone or a rock? Or if he asks a fish, you'll give him a snake. There's a Jewish writer, and I had to look it up to see what it actually looked like, but the Jerusalem scorpion. The writer went on to kind of paraphrase that section. The Jewish scorpion is a big scorpion, but when it tucks its legs and its claws in, from the top down, it looks like an egg. An egg. And then he went on to say, no father would pretend to give his son an egg, and in fact, it's a scorpion. That's a good way of illustrating it. I ought to have brought an egg and a scorpion in. What I need you to understand is that if our Heavenly Father loves us and cares for us, and He does, and our earthly parents who are evil, and most people are offended by that. Let's go on. If ye then, being evil, now who said that? Jesus said that. I don't know how you would handle that if I said that, but let me say it this way. Romans chapter 3, verse 10, there is none righteous, no, not one. We've all gone out of the way. We all seek our own. In my nature, in my flesh, I'm selfish. Don't amen that. But so are you. And so were they. And so what Jesus is doing, remember now, He's setting them up for an invitation. He wants the scribes and the Pharisees to recognize that all of their self-righteousness, all of their condemnation, all of their fancy dress, and all of the way that they conducted themselves is not going to get them to heaven. The rich young ruler that would come to Jesus and ask, how may I inherit eternal life? He went away sad because Jesus, he was satisfied in his own self-righteousness. And so Jesus is preparing them for that. So keep that in mind. So if you, who being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask Him? So there's the bonus of loving. When we ask, and we ask unselfishly, someone put it this way: if I saw that you needed a new suit, and I loved you enough to buy you a suit even when I needed one, and that the motive behind that was real love, that's the point. That's the point. Trying the hearts and the motives of God's people, that's left for one person, and it's not the preacher. It's not you. It's not a denomination. It's not Emmanuel Baptist Church. It's reserved for God. And the motive for being here, the motive for loving the family of God, is it 1 John chapter 3, verse 14, it says, brethren, we know that we pass from death unto life because we love the brethren. I don't know of anybody else I'd rather be around than you. Amen? Oh, I could have done better on that myself. Yeah, you know, I love being around you. Outside of my family, you're my most favorite people in all the world. And somebody's sitting back there going, well, you need to get out more. Well, what I need you to realize is that that's one of the evidences that we are in the family of God. We've passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. Know ye this, that when you love, and you love like Jesus, there is an affinity to the brethren. Do you always do and say and act and think like I think you should? Probably not, but then I don't either. I'm cautioning you about judging. Because like a boomerang, it comes back. And it's not just the force that you send it back or that you send it out. It comes back at you and it multiplies. And so that's why we don't judge. So then how do we love? Well, we love like this. Therefore, what's the therefore? Here's the principle, the second principle. Therefore, all things whatsoever you would do that men should do to you, do you even to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Once again, we're back to that, aren't we? I'm not going to get any better, any deeper than that. Right there. That's as deep as I need to get. When I love you like I'm supposed to, and you love me like you're supposed to, and you ask, and you seek, and you knock, in order that you might receive wisdom and have the discretion to know the difference between dogs and hogs, and you know when to offer that which is holy and when to keep back that which is pearls or has a certain value. I'm going to close with this illustration. And so while on his deathbed, he called for his grandson, who was a teenager. He brought him into the room. He said, I want to give you something. I want to give you something that's been in my family for years. And I value it very highly, and I want you to have it. And it was a gold watch. Now, being a teenager, he says, well, thanks, Grandpa. How much is it worth? He said, well, it's worth a lot to me. It's valuable to me. But how much is it worth? And he said, well, you might go to a jewelry store and find out what it's worth. So he did. He went to a jewelry store, took the gold pocket watch. And he came back to his grandfather and he says, Granddad, they only offered me $150 for that. Really? Yeah. Well, why don't you try the pawn shop? So off he runs to the pawn shop. Comes back and he's all downhearted and, well, they only offered me $10 for the gold pocket watch. And so the grandfather says, why don't you go to the museum? So he goes to the museum, and the curator says, let me see that. Can I have it for the afternoon? I want to do some research. Sure. So he went back, and the curator said, I'll give you $500,000 for it. $500,000? Yes. It's the first watch, and he named this watchmaker that it had been handed down from generation to generation. It was an antique, highly valuable. So the kid's excited, and he goes back. Let's all stand. He goes back, and he says, hey, grandfather, they offered me $500,000 for this watch. Did you know it was worth that much? He said, yes. But it's worth a whole lot more to me. And there are going to be people in your life that will not value you. They don't know your value. Don't waste your time with them. It's different from witnessing and trying to see somebody saved. That's not what I'm saying. There are going to be people that do not recognize your value, your intrinsic value. Help that not ever be our case. I value you, Miss Terry, not because you play the piano. Okay? I value you, Craig, not because you're a good-looking dude like me. Okay? I have value that I place on you folks. You ought to be in a place where people value you. They place, and you can't even put a dollar value on that.